Something shifted in the Caucasus today, quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet too precisely to be a coincidence. According to information obtained by regional observers, Ankara's recent maneuvers have redrawn the balance of power along Russia's southern frontier. Officially, these are presented as economic and cultural initiatives. Unofficially, insiders describe them as the first stage of a coordinated expansion, soft in form, but strategic in substance. Throughout the day, signals from diplomatic channels hinted at a growing unease in Moscow. Statements sounded restrained, but their tone betrayed tension. In the expert community, the phrase strategic vacuum began circulating again, referring to territories where Moscow's influence is waning, while Turkey's presence grows quietly but steadily. The pattern, analysts note, repeats the logic of the past decade: integration disguised as cooperation. By midday, reports from several border regions described intensified humanitarian projects funded through Turkish development agencies. Officially, these programs target cultural partnership and post-conflict recovery. Yet, according to people familiar with the matter, the scale of financing far exceeds any standard aid mission. Between the lines, it looks more like infrastructure for long-term positioning, a civilian facade covering geopolitical architecture. For now, Russian officials refrain from open comments. Their brief remarks sound technical, almost procedural, emphasizing the stability of the situation. But behind this composure lies concern. According to several diplomatic sources, emergency consultations were held earlier in the day between Moscow and allied administrations. The subject, however, was not disclosed. That silence alone speaks volumes. At the same time, Ankara's tone remained confident. Public statements focused on regional connectivity and mutual interests, echoing the language of multilateral cooperation. But those familiar with Ankara's regional strategy point to something deeper: a calculated shift in leverage, built on energy corridors, trade routes, and cultural diplomacy. Each step subtle, legal, yet geopolitically irreversible. Observers note that similar processes have already been registered in parts of the South Caucasus, where Moscow's logistical presence has weakened over recent months. Turkish corporations, state-backed banks, and media structures have moved in almost synchronously, filling institutional voids. For most, this appeared as natural economic diversification. For others, as a well-structured replacement. By this hour, Moscow's response remains largely rhetorical. The Kremlin's press representatives insist there is no cause for alarm, emphasizing that bilateral relations remain constructive. In the corridors of analytical centers, however, the tone is less optimistic. The discussion revolves around whether the shift is still reversible, or whether Turkey has already established a new framework of influence that Moscow can no longer fully control. Between the cautious statements and the absence of countermeasures lies a revealing silence. Something in Russia's regional calculus seems to have changed, and the balance that defined the post-Soviet Caucasus is showing its first visible cracks. Experts close to diplomatic circles describe the mood as controlled uncertainty. But even that control, they admit, looks increasingly symbolic. For now, official channels emphasize continuity. Yet off-record conversations in policy circles paint a different picture. The day's developments are seen not as a coincidence, but as the culmination of long-term preparation. Ankara is not testing Moscow's patience. It is testing its limits. Perhaps it's worth following how this silent contest unfolds next. Some observers believe today's movements are only the beginning. But beneath the surface, everything already feels different. By early afternoon, the tone across diplomatic networks began to change. Reports reaching analytical desks described a series of parallel movements, small in form but synchronized in intent. Turkish representatives intensified contacts with local administrations in several Caucasian republics, framing it as part of an interregional cooperation platform. Officially, it sounded harmless. In reality, the pace of these engagements suggested a carefully structured expansion, one that bypassed traditional channels of Russian oversight. According to sources in trade and energy sectors, new agreements were quietly initiated concerning logistics corridors and agricultural exports. None of them mentioned security or sovereignty, yet each contract redefined control over territory in practical terms. Analysts from Eurasian think tanks note a consistent strategy. Turkey positions itself not as a foreign power, but as a regional partner, one that provides capital, visibility, and access to global markets. The appeal is difficult to resist, especially where Moscow's financial instruments have lost traction. At this point, the information flow grew contradictory. Russian ministries issued brief clarifications, emphasizing that cooperation with Turkey remains stable. However, discrepancies in phrasing across different departments hinted at internal uncertainty. According to insiders, there was no unified position. Some advocated for a restrained approach, others for reasserting influence through defense and economic pressure. Neither path appeared risk-free. Meanwhile, Ankara's media ecosystem launched what experts describe as an influence narrative. Over the course of the day, regional outlets began to highlight themes of cultural unity, shared history, and economic partnership. At first glance, the coverage appeared routine, yet closer analysis revealed deliberate alignment, consistent terminology, identical timing, and messaging that gently portrayed Russia as distant, cautious, and increasingly irrelevant. The mechanism was not new, but its precision left little doubt. This was information diplomacy in full operation. In the background, European observers took note. According to data compiled by several monitoring groups, Brussels and Washington are quietly tracking the shifts, though without official comment. The West views the process pragmatically, as a recalibration within the post-Soviet sphere that could eventually dilute Moscow's leverage without direct confrontation. That interpretation, however, does not ease the unease in Russian analytical circles. For them, the pattern resembles not just a diplomatic realignment, but a controlled erosion. By midday, several policy advisors described the atmosphere in Moscow as tense but restrained. The language of official statements remained neutral. Ongoing consultations, constructive dialogue, mutual respect. Yet the absence of concrete measures hinted that the Kremlin had not anticipated the pace of Ankara's strategy. Behind closed doors, the question being asked was not how to stop the process, but whether it could still be slowed down. In expert discussions, the term silent annexation surfaced more than once, not in the military sense, but as a metaphor for gradual absorption through trade, infrastructure, and education. Turkey's scholarships, cultural programs, and investment platforms have already drawn thousands of young professionals from the Caucasus, creating a generation more integrated with Ankara than with Moscow. Economically, the shift appears subtle. Ideologically, it is transformative. Between official reassurances and field-level data lies a widening gap. According to financial analysts, Turkish capital inflows into the region have tripled compared to the previous fiscal quarter. None of these figures appear in Russia's public reports. The numbers are embedded in private trade registries, accessible only to institutional subscribers. This opacity, insiders claim, reflects an awareness within Moscow's bureaucracy that the scale of Turkey's activity has surpassed expectations. By this stage of the day, the language used in internal briefings changed tone, from observation to concern. Security committees were instructed to monitor non-traditional foreign initiatives. The phrase may sound technical, but within bureaucratic lexicon, it signals the recognition of influence risks. For years, Russia viewed the Caucasus as a managed frontier. Today, that perception is quietly fading. The territory remains within Moscow's formal sphere, but its loyalties are increasingly divided. In professional circles, some analysts draw parallels with earlier stages of Turkish involvement in Central Asia: patient, systemic, and economically attractive. Moscow once dismissed those moves as peripheral. Now the same pattern is emerging much closer to home. The distinction between partnership and presence is blurring. At the surface, nothing dramatic has happened. There are no troops, no declarations, no visible conflict. But within the architecture of influence, a slow rebalancing is underway. Officials continue to repeat that dialogue remains constructive. Experts, however, use another word: displacement. And yet, according to seasoned observers, the day's developments may only represent the first layer of a much deeper process, because what appears as cooperation on paper is, in essence, the quiet construction of a new regional order. By this point in the day, the illusion of routine began to dissolve. Inside several analytical departments, cross-referenced reports revealed patterns that had previously been dismissed as coincidences. Turkish-affiliated foundations, logistics operators, and academic institutions had been coordinating their regional activities through a unified digital framework, one that quietly mapped local administrative structures, funding flows, and cultural dependencies. Officially, it was a data-sharing platform for educational exchange. Unofficially, it looked like a soft infrastructure of governance. In expert circles, the phrase parallel integration surfaced repeatedly. It described a model in which Ankara no longer sought political agreements, but built systems that functioned autonomously from Moscow's oversight. According to insiders, these systems already operate in several sectors: trade, transport, and communication, creating a self-contained network that answers not to Kremlin ministries, but to Turkish economic centers. By this hour, some within Russia's policy apparatus began to acknowledge the scale of this shift, though only in closed briefings. Official statements still maintained composure. The tone remained procedural: ongoing dialogue, no signs of destabilization. Yet the sequence of internal correspondence obtained by regional observers suggested otherwise. Departments once responsible for coordinating cross-border projects were suddenly bypassed. Direct contacts between local authorities and Turkish agencies increased sharply. The formal hierarchy still existed, but the operational control had already migrated elsewhere. According to people familiar with the discussions inside Moscow's security councils, the realization came slowly. The South Caucasus was no longer simply a border region. It had become a field of quiet competition where influence was transferred not through treaties, but through logistics chains, investments, and narratives. One senior analyst described it as a change of operating system. Everything still looked familiar, but nothing functioned the same. In the meantime, Turkey's public posture remained measured. The language of official communiques focused on cooperation, development, and partnership. However, the pattern of announcements mirrored a deeper timeline. Each new initiative appeared hours after Russian statements, subtly redefining the frame of reference. It is not confrontation, one regional observer noted. It is preemption. But further developments indicated that even this definition might be incomplete. What looked like diplomacy was, in practice, the consolidation of influence without conflict. In economic briefings, Russian trade officials noted a sharp increase in lira-denominated settlements across Caucasian markets. The share of Russian ruble transactions, long considered dominant, had begun to decline quietly. No public data confirmed this, but financial intermediaries reported it privately. Liquidity follows trust, explained one analyst in the energy sector, and trust has started to move south. By this moment, the atmosphere inside Russian institutions turned introspective. Meetings that once centered on negotiation strategy shifted toward damage assessment. The question was no longer whether Turkey's rise in the region could be balanced, but whether Moscow still possessed tools to do so. In expert networks, the tone hardened. The term strategic encirclement reappeared, though carefully without official attribution. According to several informed insiders, part of the concern stemmed from Turkey's success in building multilateral support for its initiatives. States, once hesitant to align publicly, began endorsing joint infrastructure and energy programs. Officially, this was framed as regional cooperation. Unofficially, it represented a collective adjustment to a new center of gravity. The shift was not sudden. It was the result of cumulative decisions, years of minor projects, cultural sponsorships, and trade facilitation. Yet today, all these threads converged into a single picture. Ankara no longer operated at the periphery of Moscow's influence. It stood at its core, redefining the architecture of the Caucasus from within. In the expert community, a quiet consensus emerged. Moscow had underestimated the non-military dimension of modern geopolitics. Where it relied on military presence and formal alliances, Ankara relied on infrastructure and identity. One built borders, the other built belonging. And belonging, as analysts now admit, cannot be reclaimed through pressure alone. At the surface, the official narrative still held. Nothing extraordinary is happening, but behind it, the internal analytics described the day as a threshold moment. The game had changed form, and Russia was reacting within a paradigm that no longer applied. In private discussions, several think tank members suggested that what appeared as Turkey's regional expansion was, in fact, the emergence of a new geopolitical organism, decentralized, fluid, adaptive. A system without visible confrontation, but with irreversible consequences. It is precisely at moments like this, experts warn, that silence becomes the loudest signal. Those observing these changes closely advise paying attention to every statement, every gesture, every delay in official communication, because each one now carries strategic meaning. Perhaps it is worth continuing to watch how this transformation unfolds, for what is seen today as cooperation may soon define the new political reality of an entire region. By the second half of the day, the mood across regional command centers had become unmistakably tense. Several Russian agencies began conducting internal assessments of what they now termed foreign leverage mechanisms. The terminology itself signaled a shift from cooperation to containment. According to individuals briefed on the matter, these assessments confirmed what many in the expert community had feared. Turkey's presence in the Caucasus was no longer peripheral influence. It had matured into an operational structure, functioning parallel to Moscow's own system of control. Officially, no statements were made, but the absence of words spoke louder than any announcement. The Kremlin's traditional partners in the region, administrative elites, trade alliances, security networks, had started diversifying their loyalties. Some of them now operated under dual alignment, maintaining formal ties with Moscow while quietly negotiating with Ankara. In the language of diplomacy, this was described as strategic pluralism. In practice, it was the slow unbinding of the Russian periphery. Meanwhile, Turkey's initiatives grew bolder. Throughout the day, Ankara's foreign ministry announced a series of technical agreements with local governments, focusing on customs modernization and transport interoperability. Each agreement taken separately looked harmless, but when viewed together, analysts saw a map, one connecting the Black Sea to the Caspian under Turkish coordination. "It's no longer about influence," one observer remarked. "It's about architecture." At this point, the tone inside Russian institutions turned defensive. Departments once confident in their regional foothold began issuing contingency plans. According to reports circulating among policy analysts, Moscow is now exploring indirect means of pressure, not through military presence, but through financial dependencies and energy logistics. Yet those tools, powerful a decade ago, now appear blunted. The region's markets, infrastructure, and even information flows are already calibrated toward Ankara's systems. The transition is almost complete, though few admit it publicly. In the expert environment, several scenarios are being modeled. The first, containment through alliances. The second, adaptation to the new balance. The third, least discussed but most realistic, gradual retreat masked as strategic adjustment. According to sources close to analytical departments, internal divisions are deepening. One camp insists that Russia must reassert its authority. The other quietly argues that the cost of doing so may outweigh the benefit. Between them lies silence, the space where decisions are delayed and realities reshape themselves. Ankara, for its part, acts without visible haste. Every public statement remains framed in the vocabulary of peace and cooperation. But the pattern behind these words reveals coordination across ministries. Energy, defense, foreign trade, and cultural affairs all moving in one direction. Soft power, once an abstract concept, has become an instrument of territorial reconfiguration. And while Moscow debates its next move, Ankara continues to move without debate. By this hour, several Russian analysts began warning that the strategic frontier has shifted, not geographically but conceptually. The Caucasus, long perceived as a stable buffer, now functions as a corridor for influence leading deep into Russia's southern space. Intelligence assessments describe information corridors, media ecosystems subtly aligned with Ankara's messaging, educational networks, financial instruments, even humanitarian logistics. All of them now serve a dual purpose. The frontier has become porous, and the flow of influence is one-directional. In internal discussions, one phrase recurs: the balance has inverted. For years, Moscow defined the tempo of regional politics. Today, it is responding to it. This inversion, experts note, rarely happens overnight. It is the product of accumulation, small shifts that eventually become irreversible. By the end of the day, even moderate voices within Russia's foreign policy community concede that Ankara has mastered a form of influence projection the Kremlin can neither counter nor publicly acknowledge. Official communiques continue to emphasize dialogue and coordination. But the data tell another story. Cargo movements, banking transactions, telecommunications bandwidth, all show realignment toward Turkish infrastructure. In certain districts, Turkish service providers now handle cross-border logistics, once managed by Russian firms. Formally, nothing illegal. Politically, everything symbolic. Among foreign observers, the tone is increasingly analytical, almost detached. Western institutions interpret the process as a redistribution of influence within a changing geopolitical order. Yet inside Moscow, the perception is more visceral. It is not a redistribution, but a displacement. The idea that Russia might lose its traditional stronghold without a single confrontation challenges decades of strategic doctrine. And while the public narrative remains calm, in private, concern has turned into quiet urgency. In policy corridors, voices are lowering, and meetings are extending into the night. Officials talk about temporary turbulence, but no one defines how temporary it might be. At the same time, Turkish channels radiate confidence. The word stability dominates every briefing, every publication, every televised appearance. Behind that word lies precision, a controlled advance masked as equilibrium. However, behind Moscow's closed doors, the tone has changed. The silence is heavier, the pauses longer, the reports more cautious. Because at this stage, it has become evident to those who read between the lines. The Caucasus is no longer a question of geography. It is a question of control. And behind that realization stands an even more complex truth, one that Moscow is only beginning to confront. By the final hours of the day, a stillness settled over Moscow's political centers, the kind of stillness that follows recognition, not surprise. official channels maintained their tone of procedural normalcy. Yet within analytical departments, the language changed irreversibly. The Caucasus was no longer spoken of as a border zone, but as a transitional region, a term carrying quiet acknowledgement that its strategic allegiance had already begun to drift. In confidential memoranda circulating among policy circles, Turkey's ascent is now described as a structural shift, not an episode. It is a phrase loaded with implication that Moscow's influence has not been challenged, but absorbed, redistributed through civilian mechanisms that elude conventional countermeasures. According to several well-placed insiders, this is the first time in decades that Russia's southern vector is being recalibrated by external momentum rather than domestic design. Official spokespeople continue to insist that dialogue remains open. Their statements sound calm, even confident, yet the frequency of interdepartmental meetings and the pace of information briefings reveal another reality. Control has become reactive. The Kremlin's apparatus, long accustomed to setting the agenda, now spends its time verifying the actions of others. In expert terms, it is a shift from initiative to observation, a subtle but decisive change in strategic rhythm. Meanwhile, Ankara acts with mathematical composure. No declarations, no overt challenges, only continuity. Turkish agencies expand cooperation programs, their embassies coordinate humanitarian forums, and investment banks extend credit to Caucasian enterprises once reliant on Russian subsidies. The process feels administrative, almost bureaucratic, and precisely for that reason, irreversible. Power, as one observer quietly put it, now moves through paperwork, not pipelines. In the expert community, the debate has evolved. Some argue that Moscow still retains leverage, energy routes, security alliances, cultural presence. Others counter that influence without initiative is a mirage. Data compiled by regional analysts supports the latter view. Trade patterns, information flows, and demographic preferences all point south. A generation shaped by Turkish education and digital ecosystems now defines the region's public discourse. Borders remain unchanged, but orientation has shifted. Between these lines, a new reality emerges, not declared, but felt. Russia's role, though not diminished overnight, is being reframed. Each cautious statement, each delayed response, each silence now contributes to the quiet acknowledgement that a historical transition is underway. The Caucasus, once a fixed axis of Russian policy, is turning into a variable in Ankara's geometry of influence. In the corridors of analytical institutions, this awareness carries an unusual calm. No panic, no open dissent, just a collective understanding that the architecture of power has adjusted itself, while officials continued to speak of stability. According to seasoned observers, such transitions never announce themselves. They accumulate through contracts, logistics, language, until one day the balance has already changed, and the change feels natural. By this moment, the wider international community has begun to frame the development as part of a post-regional order. Western experts describe it as a peaceful reconfiguration, a model of influence that substitutes confrontation with absorption. In Moscow, the same phrase is translated differently, as erosion. The semantics vary, but the outcome remains the same. The Caucasus no longer moves in Russia's orbit alone. Yet amid these quiet assessments, a few voices within policy analysis still insist that reversibility is possible. They speak of recalibration, of adaptation, of waiting for the next cycle. But even among them, the tone lacks conviction. The data no longer supports the hope of symmetry. The geopolitical fabric, once tightly woven around Russian institutions, now stretches toward Ankara's economic and cultural gravity. At the surface, everything remains composed: flags, ceremonies, routine visits. But underneath, the motion is clear. The line dividing influence from dependence has grown thin, and Turkey now writes the vocabulary of cooperation on its own terms. According to observers close to both capitals, no confrontation will occur. None is needed. What has happened today is quieter, and therefore stronger. It is the moment when one power ceases to contest and begins to adapt, when territory transforms into context. In the expert environment, this day will be remembered not for a single statement or event, but for its tone, restrained, procedural, almost indifferent. The day when the Caucasus stopped being a question of borders and became a reflection of influence. And somewhere between the official briefings and the unspoken acknowledgments, one thought now lingers among those who read the signals carefully. Power does not always change hands through conflict. Sometimes it simply migrates, unnoticed, until it is already gone.